Does hypnosis actually work? Well, let's cut right to the chase. Yeah, it does. Let me tell you a little story. A couple of years ago, I was fed up. I'd had this recurring dream for going on 30 years, and it was really interesting because what I'd found is that I had the same series of things happen in the dream for as long as I could remember. Since as long as I could remember, there was a sequence of events that happened a few times a month where in my dream, I would start by feeling a sense of immense fear, and then it would progress to me being chased by some sort of malevolent force. Sometimes the force had a face to it or a name, sometimes it was just a feeling. And then, as I was chased by that force, I'd realized that I couldn't escape from it. And I started to understand that although I couldn't escape, somehow I knew deep down I was going to make it. And I was trapped and I was enclosed. And just before the resolution of the dream was about to occur, when, if you were watching a TV show, you'd find out how the hero was going to live or die, I'd wake up. And although I would wake up and realize that I was safe in my room, the dream itself was always very shocking and it was always very taxing on me mentally. And about 3 years ago, I got fed up with this dream and I wanted to figure out how to resolve it, but I didn't have any tools. And it just so happened that at that time, I came across a man who you might have heard of before. His name is Carl Jung, C.G. Jung, who was a Swiss German psychiatrist back in the early 1900s, who honestly I consider to be a modern day shaman. And I read his book, which was essentially an autobiography called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And in this book, he really just lays out his case for why the subconscious is one of the most important things you can study in your life, because essentially it is your life. Your waking life is such a small part of your reality, but it's really the only thing that you give consideration to. Jung said that being in your dream and experiencing your dream is like touching nature from the inside. Just like we go outside in the forest to touch nature in external reality, or into the ocean to touch nature in external reality, being in our dreams is like touching nature from the inside. And his work really fascinated me. I went down the Carl Jung rabbit hole and I started to really think about my dreams and how important they were. And I came to realize that this dream that I was having had some significance. It wasn't just happening randomly. It was also along that time that I started to study a man named Stanislav Grof, who wrote a book called Healing Our Deepest Wounds, The Holotropic Paradigm Shift. This book also shook me to my core because it talked about the fact that before your personal identity, in your personal biography, which is everything after you're born, you experience things that are both during the birth process and even before the birth process. And Stanislav Grof talks about the concept of perinatal trauma, which are things that happen in the birth process and before the birth process. And he even talks about transpersonal history, which is the history of our people, not just my people, but your people too, the history of humanity throughout time, archetypal history, and things that we experience as a collective species. And of course, this ties into Jung, who really popularized the idea of archetypes. And so I started to weave these concepts together, and I really started to respect my dreams more. And I wanted to learn more about myself and the inside life that maybe hadn't been expressed, that was trying to come out through my dreams. And the first thing I started to do was to write those dreams down. And eventually I realized that this dream that I told you about followed this specific format. And I would write down my dreams every night. And every time that that format appeared, I would label it DT1, which stands for Dream Template 1. And I started to become more familiar with the signs that this dream was occurring. And I decided to do a past life regression with a hypnotherapist. This is when I was living in Portland at the time. And hey, Portland is a weird place, but there are hypnotherapists all over the world. You can find one. And look, at first I was skeptical. I mean, I'm a logical guy. I'm a business guy. I put on my pants just like you, all that stuff. But I'm open to the power of the mind for sure. I mean, I'll talk more on the channel later about my experience with psychedelics. I've had videos on that in the past, and I've deleted them. I might bring some back, and I might make some new ones. But of course, I've had experience with psychedelics that I find very powerful, and I respect the power of the mind. But seeing myself as especially a Taurus, someone who's logical, someone who's grounded, someone who's, like quote unquote down to earth, I wasn't really sure if this was going to work. However, I was really curious and anxious to find out what I would discover if I went through this past life regression with a hypnotherapist. So I drove up to the place, and it was interesting because the lady almost reminded me of a character from Harry Potter. She was a little bit disorganized. Her office was a bit disheveled. She had papers everywhere, kind of strewn all about. And she even apologized to me. She said, normally I like to record these things, but I don't have my tape recorder with me today, or my tape recorder is broken. I just thought that was funny because who would have a tape recorder? This is 2022 this was, 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought, what do you mean your tape recorder is broken? Who's using a tape recorder? However, I was open to it. And we talked for a bit about what my goals were and why I wanted to do this. And she took me into a trance. It's very simple. She had me count back from 10 and 9 and 8 and 7. And she took me all the way down until she guided me through a visualization where she first took me on a very beautiful nature scene. And she really painted the picture to help me visualize exactly where I was in my mind. She had me walk through a field. She had me feel the quality of the leaves and the grass and the flowers and the wind, and smell what I was smelling and taste what I was tasting. And it was a visceral experience as I was dropping into this meditation, or this hypnosis. And what was interesting was the first thing I noticed was just being extremely relaxed. And I think this came from her just being very practiced at coaching people into a state of neurological relaxation. So I felt very at ease. Of course, I wasn't completely in a trance yet. I could still hear the cars outside. I could still hear the air conditioner humming. I could still feel that I was in my present room today in today's world. But I was starting to feel more suggestible. And she guided me to walk to a door, and she allowed me to feel the weight of the handle on my hand by just speaking to me about it, and she guided me to open the door and walk through the door. And once I was through the door, she had me then narrate my experience, asking me what I saw and what I felt and where I was. And it was really interesting because the first place that she took me, actually, really what it was is we knew that I came to do a past life regression. Now I'm remembering it. We knew that I'd come to do a past life regression. And as she had me walk through that door, she had me visualize the moment of being born. Now, what's interesting about this is when you're trying to remember a memory that's very, very distant, you fear that you might make some things up. You fear that you might create memories that weren't actually there because the brain is actually very good at implanting things that never actually happened. But she took me through the experience of being born. And what was interesting about that is that I was born prematurely, and one of my lungs, or actually both of my lungs, collapsed when I was an infant, and I had to be in the NICU, so I was in the neonatal intensive care unit. And she had me describe the feeling, the sensation of being essentially strangled at birth. No one was strangling me, but it was the feeling of being completely out of oxygen, completely out of air. And she took me through this entire birth experience. And what was so interesting was after she took me through that experience, she had me completely visualize the room. She had me completely drop into that moment. Then she took me up through my childhood, from being born all the way through childhood. And then she took me through another door, and we went into a past life. And you have to understand, during this time, as she's taking me through the experience, she was so good at leading me into this sensory adventure that I did start to disconnect from present reality. I did start to be fully in the experience. And even though I could still hear the cars outside and I could still hear things that were going on, they became integrated into the moment where I couldn't really tell what was now and what was maybe then. I couldn't really tell what I was hearing and what I was making up. And I wasn't consciously processing the fact that I was in a hypnotic experience. I was just feeling what I was feeling, hearing what I was hearing, tasting what I was tasting. Now, I have to say, this is probably a benefit of having done quite a lot of psychedelics in my life, is that I can appreciate being completely dropped into the moment without any other distractions. And of course, you can certainly learn this through meditation as well. It's not just psychedelics that teach you this. In fact, you probably should work towards meditation before you really delve into hardcore psychedelics. But at the same time, looking back on it, I'm amazed at what the power of the mind can do under completely normal circumstances with no exogenous substances. It's pretty amazing, actually. And she took me through a past life. And I've always felt a really deep personal connection to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. I've always been really fascinated with Greece and Rome to a certain extent, and Morocco and Egypt. And I've traveled to all those places, and I've always felt a personal connection to that area. And I know that the Middle East is different than the Mediterranean, but I do consider that whole area to be the cradle of humanity. And, or if not, that we could talk about the Africa thing later. I mean, we know that Africa was the birthplace of humanity, and Morocco and Egypt are in Africa. We know that probably humanity was born in the Congo. But I mean, just from a mythological perspective, there's so much in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. She took me through an experience. She told me some things about who I was in the past, and I felt some things. It's not really important to go deeply into it, and I've actually written all this down, and at some point it will come out in one of my books. But the effect was really interesting because just as she inducted me into the experience, she pulled me out of it by taking me back to that same field, to that same forest, walking through a door again and counting me from 10 to 1 and bringing me back. And what was so interesting is that so much energy was released during this time that I absolutely exploded. I gushed with tears. I was literally sobbing. I had some boogers coming down my nose, and my eyes were just pooled with tears. A lot of energy was released. And like I said, I was so amazed by what the body can do that is truly transcendent and psychedelic with and my mic just died. I'll have to recharge it. That's okay. And you know what? This is the crazy part. That day, after that experience, I got really sick. It's almost like my entire immune system shut down. I mean, it kind of did. And guess what happened? I got COVID. Yeah, I got COVID. That same day, when I got back, that day, I got COVID. It was really amazing. I mean, the COVID was not amazing, but the synchronicity of that. Now, as a side note, at this time, this was 2022. Yeah, it was. Or was it 21? I'll have to look. It was 21 or 22. I'll have to look back at my notes again. But I happen to have some ivermectin on hand, and I gotta say, that ivermectin knocked that shit out, bro. It knocked it out. But COVID does not feel good. And I know that I had COVID because I got a test. So I got very sick, and eventually I was on the mend. But here's the fascinating part. When I came to, after my hypnotic experience, after having my immune system essentially shut down, and then after coming out of it, I never had the dream again. And now we're in 2026, so it's been like 4+ years since that experience, and I've never had the dream, the nightmare again. I've never had the feeling of being trapped, the feeling of running, the feeling of being chased, the evil force, the feeling of rebirth. And I tie all this back to Jung and back to Stan Grof. The idea of perinatal trauma, the idea that, well, this is what I believe. I believe that because I was born prematurely and my lungs collapsed, my brain internalized that as a trauma. And it internalized it, and it created this mythological component to it, which essentially created an archetype around the evil force that I was being subjected to. And that nightmare represented my birth experience, because me being born was almost dying for me. And after I was able to go back into that experience through hypnosis, I was able to integrate that experience because I was able to understand what happened. And of course, there were some other things in my past life regression that she showed me that allowed me to integrate everything that happened. And once I integrated that, and the reason why I know that this is what occurred is because from that day forward, after the hypnotic regression, I never had that dream again. And I'd been having it for 30 years. And so, yeah, man, hypnosis works. And it's a powerful tool for integrating the things that might be lurking just beneath the surface of your subconscious. And I'd highly encourage you to try it. I'd also highly encourage you to respect your dreams. They're not just random movies that play in the back of your head. They're not just interesting tidbits that are fun. They're real pieces of your life, and they might be the most important pieces of your life that you're not paying attention to. We spend so much time in our waking reality and our waking identity, we forget that more than half of our life is asleep. Or, I guess if you do that, it depends on who you are. A lot of your life is asleep. Depends on how much you're sleeping, but a significant portion. And while you're sleeping, your brain is processing information, and it's healing, and it's remembering, and it's connecting to things that you'll never touch in your conscious life. And I'd highly recommend you to start writing down your dreams. And when you go into sleep tonight, just make a conscious decision to say, hey, I'm going to remember this dream. I'm going to remember my sleep tonight. And as soon as you wake up, write that stuff down. And your brain will start to acknowledge and appreciate those dreams, and it will start to remember them more. And the more you write them down, the more you'll remember. And then I want you to go and look back through what you remember, and I want you to look at it with no judgment, and just to start to make some connections. And realize that the symbols in your dreams might not be things that are happening in your everyday life, but they represent an innate knowledge that you have access to. There's, something called the Akashic Records, which is basically the record of everything that's ever been said, uttered, thought in the past, present, and future. It's the record of all that is. You can choose to believe that or not. Don't really care. But there are people out there who not only believe it, but know that these realities exist. And I think Carl Jung was one of them. When he was interviewed in this must have been the 40s, 50s, probably the 50s, his interviewer said, "Do you believe in God?" And Jung said, "I don't believe in God. I know God." And when you know something, you don't believe it. You just know. And so that's what I'll leave you with. Respect the inner world. And know that if there are things you're struggling with in your outer world, oftentimes the inner world has some answers for you. But you can't get there through the logical means. However, there are guides that have been there in the past. There are people who've traversed this land before you. And I'd recommend that you read some of their books. I recommend that you read Stan Grof. I recommend that you read Carl Jung. I recommend that you read Alan Watts. all three of whom were contemporaries of each other. Because the human experience is so much more than the day-to-day humdrum, go to work, collect a paycheck. You come from a deep lineage of sacred wisdom, and that can be accessed at any time when you acknowledge it and you respect it. So yeah, hypnosis works. See you tomorrow.